Good day, folks. Today we're talking about Chapter 10, Sexual Expression, and really the chapter is ultimately about the physical aspects of sexual experience in terms of how the body responds under the influence of sexual arousal through orgasm and back to non-arousal conditions. So we have to talk first about hormones. Hormones are incredibly important to the process and the experience of sexual expression. So we're talking chiefly about estrogen, largely for women, and testosterone, largely for men. Keep in mind that these hormones, although they are produced throughout our lifetimes, the amount of production does vary, and it tends to wane as we age, and that's a normal physiological process. However, that differs from person to person. So for some people, that may be problematic. For instance, so for some women, changes in estrogen levels may lead to vaginal dryness, and so that can also lead to a lack of arousal and a lack of desire, depending on again how much has been lost. Conversely, for men, if you will, testosterone, that also production wise tends to wane as men age. That can lead to secondary sexual characteristics. It can lead to men having less firm, less vigorous erectile response, and less arousal as well, in addition to some depressive symptoms. And again, these are normal physiological changes and processes that accompany aging, but nevertheless, they ultimately matter with respect to how we experience desire and whether or not we have desire, in a sense, like we may have had at a younger point in life. So, normal for these, if you will, hormones to fluctuate and to ratchet down, and there are things that can be done to combat the challenges that they may present in terms of sexual arousal, sexual functioning, and we'll talk about that once we get to chapter 14 and talk about sexual functioning. So in addition to hormones, our culture, our ethnic background, and our culture matter with respect to what we are willing and what we tend to be willing and able to do sexually and conceptually, how we conceptualize and how we think about sex and sexuality. A lot of that is shaped by culture, and a lot of that is shaped by our cultural background, what country or nation of origin we're from, where our parents are from, and the kinds of messages that we ultimately hear and gather in our minds about sex. The second paper, the reading that you'll do for that literature review rather, the We Don't Sleep Around paper by Yen Lee Espiritu is a great example of the cultural aspects with respect to sexual expression and identity and that intersection, particularly for Filipino girls and Filipino women, insofar as how they're raised to think about sex and how what choices that they ultimately should make in a way that respects their bodies, but is also thought to respect the culture. So it's an interesting read. I think you'll enjoy it. All right, so we need to talk about sexual response. We need to talk about what is happening to the body during the sexual experience, from the moment of sort of conceptualizing the possibility of sex to things going back to their if you will, arousal state or pre-arousal condition. And a lot of this comes from the work initially, at least from the work of Masters and Johnson. And again, a lot of what they did hewed closely, if you will, to the medical model. They earnestly felt, well, that there wasn't, if you will, much known about how the body responded to sexual stimuli and to just the experience that people have sexually. And so a lot of what they did within the laboratory setting was to try indeed to chart how typical response occurs to arousal, orgasm, and then back again. And so they developed a commonly cited four-phase sexual response cycle: excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution, that both sexes are thought to go through with respect to sexual arousal, orgasm, and then back to pre-arousal conditions. So for both sexes, the excitement phase is marked by what we call vasocongestion. Vasocongestion is a fancy word that basically says blood gathers. It gathers into the genital region of the woman's body, of the man's body, in terms of the penis, the labia majora and minora, and the clitoris. And so blood rushing to these areas, this vasocongestion, is key to sexual arousal and, of course, to eventually the orgasm. And even though talking about blood isn't necessarily sexy, how blood flows in the body, how blood flows within one's body is incredibly important to sexual arousal, awareness, as well as orgasm. And so we'll be talking about that, the role that blood flow and blood circulation throughout the body, what that can and sometimes cannot do with respect to sexual functioning. We'll get to that also in chapter 14. So vasocongestion. So again, when someone gets excited, that is marked physiologically by the blood rushing, collecting towards the genital region. For women, they also may see blood rush toward the breasts, the nipples, and the areola, and that may result in what we call a sex flush, the sort of reddening, if you will, that is consistent with that vasocongestion going there, and also consistent, of course, with becoming excited and turned on. And so that's really what we're talking about. This initial being turned on is marked by that vasocongestion. Now, the next phase is plateau, and that's where things get really, really hot and really, really heavy, as hot and heavy as they can be physiologically. So you'll see that for, again, women in particular, the sex flush is very prominent. The breasts, the nipples are erect and very firm at this point. So that's also a hallmark sign of this, if you will, quickening of the pace of the excitement aspect of sex, the anticipation of that. The clitoris will retract from the clitoral hood, and that rubbing process is often what is also key to the orgasm that a woman may have or experience. Some men during the plateau phase may also experience a sex flush in their chest. What often happens is they'll have some pre-ejaculatory cum that appears on the head or the tip or the shaft, if you will, of the penis as well. You can think of the plateau phase as people getting to the point where they are just incredibly excited just right before they have their orgasm. So it's as excited as you can be before the orgasm occurs. Stage 3 is orgasm, and that's, of course, where vigorous contractions within the body musculature in the core region of the body are set off, and you see fluid expelled by the Skene's glands for women, and you see fluid expelled from the head or the shaft, the tip of the penis for men with respect to ejaculation, and that's the feeling of ejaculatory inevitability for men. And the fourth phase is what we call resolution. That's where things go back to how they were pre-excitement wise before a person got turned on. For men, there's what we call a refractory period that's added to this. The refractory period is like this sort of physiological timeout where typically a man cannot be immediately stimulated to an additional orgasm, again, immediately, that is. This refractory period tends to lengthen as a man ages. Again, individual experience of the refractory period will vary from person to person, from man to man, and a lot of it also has to do with other aspects, other dimensions of physiological health that the man may experience. And again, we'll talk about that once we get to chapter 14. Also, I want to share with you, too, a great thing to also keep in mind are the health benefits of sex. And often, again, in our society, and we've talked about that particularly in terms of the social history of sex, a lot of our social history borrows heavily from a lot of traditions like the Victorian tradition as well as the early Christian tradition that were very bemoaning about and very negative about and judgmental about sex and sexuality. They weren't necessarily in sex-positive times. However, sex has a number of health benefits, particularly in terms of longevity, of lifespan, helping folks get to sleep a lot easier, for instance, and also relief of pain and inflammation and other kinds of diseases and illnesses that having regular sexual activity is often disassociated with a lot of negative potential illnesses, obviously, if we're talking about cancers, breast in particular, if we're talking also about endometriosis. These are conditions that having a regular, if you will, sexual appetite can be helpful in navigating and negotiating these conditions. It's not that they'll all go away, but certainly many of these things can be kept away for a while or at least made to be lessened, if you will, conditionally. So there's a good article, a good write-up about this that I have put on for this week called The Health Benefits of Sexual Expression. I think you'll find that very, very very insightful and interesting.